Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I want to begin by thanking SEA Cooperative Research and Zidian Labs for hosting this webinar and for the invitation to speak. My name is Kevin Kulbacki. I'm a forensic document examiner and handwriting expert in private practice in Chicago. I'm board certified by the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners. I spent a good part of my career working on published standards that govern how the discipline does its work. And I teach forensic document examination as well at the university level. I tell you that not as a resume, but so you know where this talk is coming from. Casework, standards, and the classroom in roughly equal parts. And so here's what I'd like to do with our time today. This is a talk about one concept, not a comprehensive overview of the whole discipline, not a product demonstration, one concept. And it's about the range of variation in handwriting. It's the concept that separates a defensible conclusion of authorship of a question entry from a premature one. And I'm going to build it from the ground up so that whether you're a handwriting expert, an expert in another forensic discipline, or someone with no forensic background at all, you should leave with the same understanding. And I'm going to anchor it in a real case. It's an anonymized one, but a real one that had real consequences. We'll open with it and we'll close with it as well. I will try to take some questions at the end. We should have about a good 10 minutes or so at the end. So with that said, let's dive in. In this case, we had two notes that appeared on the walls of a school, written directly on the walls, threatening violence against the school and the people in it. This exact situation, unfortunately, plays out far more often than one would ever hope or think. While some threats may make it to the public eye, many are carefully resolved behind the scenes. I want you to sit in the position of the people who find these notes. A threat like this cannot be triaged slowly. The school has to make decisions within minutes to hours. Do we close the building? Do we bring in law enforcement? What do we tell the parents? Every one of those decisions is made under scrutiny, and every one of them turns, at least in part, on a single question. Who wrote the notes? Now, I want you to notice what kind of question that is. It is not a question about what the notes say or about the veracity of the threat. Everyone can read them. It's a question about the writing itself. Handwriting put those words on a wall, and handwriting is, in principle, examinable. Somebody's hand produced these forms, and that individual has writing habits. In this case, there was writing available for comparison. Writing from a student produced in the ordinary course of school life, homework, classroom notes, the kind of writing that nobody produces with an audience in mind. So the raw materials for an examination existed from the beginning: question writing on a wall and known writing. In this case, suspicion fell on a student quite early, based on CCTV footage, and from there, investigators collected a few homework assignments for comparison. Over time, that grew into an extensive collection of known writing: homework, classroom notes, notebooks. Again, a fairly significant and substantial amount of writing for comparison. The question, though, is what do you do with those materials? And just important, what must you not do with them? Hold that thought and hold the images of these two notes, because everything for the next about 45 minutes is in service of answering that question properly. And at the end, I'll tell you what actually happened in this case. Now, before we talk about how to get it right, let's be precise about what getting it wrong looks like in a case like this. Because in a case like this, there's always exactly two ways, and they are not symmetrical in character, only in cost. The first is false negative. The true writer is in front of you, the writer is examined, and the examination clears them. Think about what that means here. Threat remains real and unresolved. The school reopens or doesn't, and on the basis of a false all clear. The danger, whatever it is, remains inside the building, and now nobody is actually looking for it. The second, however, is a false positive. The wrong student is named. The student's life is therefore upended by an accusation of threatening their own school. And this is the part that's easy to miss. The real writer is still out there. A false positive is not one harm in this instance. It's both harms at once. And it's important to remember the clock is running the entire time. Every threat must be treated as credible, which means the examination begins immediately. There's no option to wait for a quieter week, no option to wait for additional evidence, but notice the trap built into that urgency. Time pressure is precisely the condition under which people are going to cut corners, and corners cut in a handwriting examination produce exactly the 2 errors I just described. So the question of this talk is really this: how do you examine handwriting quickly and thoroughly at the same time? And the answer runs through one concept. To get there, I want to start with something that has nothing to do with handwriting at all. Let's begin with part 1, understanding variation. For the next few minutes, I'm not going to show you any handwriting. In fact, I'm going to show you fonts. Everyone in this room, whatever your background, has an intuition about fonts. And it turns out that intuition can carry almost the entire conceptual weight of this conversation. So follow me through this little thought experiment. Here is the letter K, 1 character in 1 typeface, Arial, regular. You know what this is. In fact, you've seen it thousands of times on screens, on documents. If I asked you to picture the letter K, something very close to this would probably be what your mind produces. But here's the thing. Every time you encounter the Arial letter K, it doesn't always look like this. Sometimes the Arial letter K is heavier. Sometimes it slants. 3 visibly different forms now. And if you measure them, they would differ in stroke width, angle, and proportion. And yet nobody in the audience is confused at what you're looking at. It's still 1 character, 1 typeface, presented in 3 variations. I want to plant 1 word here, and it's that word, variations. The same identity can legitimately present in more than 1 form. That's not a contradiction. It's simply a property of the thing that we're looking at. One more observation before we move on, because it matters later. Within each of these variations, every rendering is identical. Every Arial bold K that has been printed is, for our purposes today, going to be the same K. Keep that thought in the back of your mind as we move forward. Now let's widen the frame, because there's already a second thing you already know about the letter K. You don't always type it with Arial. Sometimes it might be in Times New Roman, or perhaps more rarely and perhaps regrettably in Comic Sans. Now, look what's on the screen. Across the top of what we've just established, 1 style, Arial, and its variations, and down the column, something new, the same letter, regular weight each time, but built genuinely different each time. Different constructions, different shapes, different decisions about how a K should be made. These aren't variations of 1 style. These are alternate styles. And here's the natural next question. Do those alternate styles behave the same way that Arial did, and do they have their own variations? As you can see, they do. Times New Roman has its bold and italic, so does Comic Sans. 9 boxes now, and each letter on this screen is representing the same letter K. So now we have what I would describe as a 2-level structure, and I'd like you to hold on to both levels. Character can have alternate styles, and each of those alternate styles has its own variations. 9 visibly different forms here, and every one representing still a lowercase k. Now, if you're wondering why a handwriting talk is spending time on typography, here is the reason. This 2-level structure, styles and variations within styles, is exactly the same structure we're going to find in handwriting. But before we get there, let's do something with this analogy. Let's run a comparison. On the right side of the screen, we can see the same 9 forms you've been looking at. Call them known. On the left, we have a new form, and we're going to call it questioned. And here is exactly that, the question. So answer it for yourself. Does the question form fall within the range of variation established by the known, or is it external to it? Now, I suspect nobody found this difficult. The question form shares almost nothing with the 9 known forms. Yes, it's still a letter K, but the strokes are uniform, where the knowns are more modulated, the construction is different, the proportions are different. It falls outside or external to that range. And the natural conclusion is that it came from a different source. In this example, a different typeface. Now, again, I suspect nobody found this different or difficult. Look at what separates the question form from all 9 notes. Serifs are heavy rectangular slabs, where the only serifs on the right, Times New Romans, are fine and tapered. Strokes are single uniform weight throughout. Its proportions are more like typewriter proportions, wide and mechanical. built to occupy a fixed cell. Construction, weight, proportion, it aligns with nothing on the right. So in other words, it falls outside or external to the range established by the right. And the natural conclusion, therefore, again, is that it is from a different source or a different typeface. Now let's do this again. Here we have a new question form. Same question. And again, I want you to answer for yourself. Is this within that range or external to that range? It's a little bit easier this time. Within clearly. In fact, you can point to exactly where it sits. It is the Times New Roman italic, and it matches that known form precisely. It's not close to it, not consistent with it. It is identical to it. Every measurement you could take, stroke for stroke, would agree. So there are your two comparisons. One question form that aligned with nothing in the known set and was external to the range, and one that landed squarely inside of it, on top of a known form, an exact duplicate. Same question, both times, opposite answers, and in both directions. The answer was only available because you had a full range of variation laid out in front of you. Now, I wanted you to notice what made the second comparison so comfortable. You had an exact match. The question form and the known form were literally the same object. That certainly felt pretty good, didn't it? Enjoy it, because that's a luxury of a kind of pattern we've been playing with, and you're about to lose it. Handwriting will rarely hand you the exact form that you're looking for, not even when the same person wrote both documents. Why that is and what that means for everything we do is covered in the next slide. And so here is the core distinction of this entire talk, and it's the reason handwriting examination is fundamentally its own discipline. Fonts are static patterns. Every rendering of the same font in the same weight and style is generally identical. I said generally, and there's an asterisk on the slide because rendering does vary slightly across devices and operating systems, but the underlying design does not change for the context of this talk. If you've seen one Arial bold K, you have, in a meaningful sense, seen them all. One reference will tell you everything. Handwriting, however, is a dynamic pattern. And this is the sentence I'd like you to take home, even if you take home nothing else. Every instance of the same content, provided it is sufficiently complex, shows some level of variation. No writer, not one, will produce a sufficiently complex body of writing, such as a signature, identically twice. The pattern we examine is not a fixed object that gets photographed well or badly. The pattern itself is in motion every single time it is produced. And I want to flag that phrase I mentioned earlier, sufficiently complex, because the examiners in the audience are going to expect me to say so. A very simple form, for example, a single downstroke, a dot, may not exhibit variation that you can really use. Complexity is what gives variation room to express itself, and that has real consequences for what writing can and cannot support in terms of a conclusion. We will come back to that. So here's the question that this distinction forces, and it's the hinge of part one of this talk. If the pattern varies every single time it's produced, what does one example of a writer's letter actually tell you? And let's find out. Same exact setup as before. You have a question form on the left, and you have a known form on the right. But this time, you only get one known. Why? The two forms differ. You can see it. The question form slants, the known stands upright. So is the question form within the range of variation? The answer is quite simple. You cannot tell. And I want to be precise about the difference you're seeing is real, but has different possible explanations. And with one known, you can't choose amongst them. It may be a difference that is outside the range of variation, or it may be an alternate style or variation that you simply don't have in your known standards. In fact, some of you may have noticed this question form is the very same slanted K that was sitting inside your known grid 2 slides ago. 2 slides ago, you would have placed this within the range of variation without hesitation because you had the range in front of you and you had an adequate quantity of known examples to resolve that question. Nothing about the question form has changed. The only thing that changed is how much known material you were given, and your confident answer became no answer at all. And that's the lesson of part one, and it's worth saying it quite plainly. One example alone tells you almost nothing about the range. When a comparison fails, the problem is very often not the question writing. It's generally speaking, in many instances, the lack of adequate known examples. The difference on its own may be uninterpretable. It only acquires that meaning when established against an adequate, established range of variation. Now, before we leave part one, I want to also place handwriting against other pattern comparison disciplines, because some of you may work in them, and because the comparison is genuinely clarifying. I'd frame it as a spectrum, not as a hierarchy. No discipline here is easier. They just carry different problems. Consider, for example, latent prints. The source of the pattern is a physical object, friction ridge skin, permanent and effectively fixed. Where does variation enter? Well, really at deposition. Pressure, the surface, how much of the finger touched. The examiner's task ultimately is to see through that distortion laid over a stable pattern. Faces sit somewhere in the middle. There is a stable underlying anatomy, but it drifts. Aging, weight, expression, and every capture varies with pose, lighting, and sensors. Face examiners have a pattern for this, within-person variability. Their pattern is mostly stable. Their images, however, are not. Then we get to handwriting at the far end. There is no fixed object at all. It is a mental motor program that exists. The pattern is a behavioral performance produced fresh every single time, and variation enters at the production itself. In prints, variation is largely something that happens to the pattern. In handwriting, variation is a property directly of the pattern itself. The writer's identity does not live in any single specimen. It lives in the shape of the whole distribution of forms that that writer will actually produce. Which is why the thing that a handwriting examiner must characterize is not a distortion model. It's not an image quality program. It is actually what we would describe as the writer's full range of variation. And one more sentence for precision. Since this phrase handwriting analysis does get used loosely in culture, I want to be clear, none of this is about graphology. We are making no claims about personality or anything of the sort from writing. This is a comparison discipline, forms against forms, ranges against ranges. And so that's part one. You now have the concept. Part two is going to be about the two directions in which handwriting varies and about a question we haven't touched yet. How much is a similarity actually worth? If I go back one moment here. So we're moving on to part two. Handwriting varies. We've already established that fact. But now let's be precise about the two directions in which it varies between writers and within a writer. And then let's ask a question that gives the comparison its teeth. Are all features created equal? And spoiler alert, they are not. And there's actually measured data on exactly how unequal they can be. So with this, I want to dive into two definitions, and they're short because you've already done the conceptual work with the fonts. Inter-writer variation is the differences between one writer's handwriting and another. It's what makes discrimination between writers possible at all. If everyone wrote identically, this discipline could not exist. Intra-writer variation, however, is the variation that occurs within a single writer's own handwriting. It is the range each writer naturally occupies, and it is why this discipline can be hard. And I'll express the entire tension of handwriting examination in two sentences. Comparison is possible because writers differ. It's difficult because each writer varies too. The examiner's whole task is telling apart those two types of variation. Now, is inter-writer variation real, or is it an article of faith? And here I do want to bring in research. Specifically, a national federally funded, published in the Journal of Forensic Science study that collected roughly 1,500 handwriting specimens from across the United States and paired them to samples demographically representative of the US adult population. Hundreds of cursive specimens, hundreds of hand-printed ones. Each specimen was assigned, or assessed, I should say, against hundreds of precisely defined characteristics, presence versus absence. Characteristics vetted so rigorously that a single disagreement between trained examiners was grounds for throwing the characteristic out of the study. Here is the finding that matters most for us today. Not one pair of writers within the study, in either cursive or the hand-printed samples, shared the exact same combination of characteristics. The closest two writers in the entire study still differed on dozens of features. Every writer occupied their own region of the space. I'll add the caution that the study's own authors added because intellectual honesty demands it. Presence and absence of the catalog features is not by itself how authorship is determined, and a full examination assesses far more features than any catalog can possibly create. But as an empirical demonstration that writers are distinguishable at scale, it is exactly the foundation that this discipline stands on. And the same study gives us something which is even more useful, which I'm going to discuss on the next slide. That same national study measured something the discipline had long understood qualitatively, but could now quantify. How often specific handwriting features put numbers on, and how often specific handwriting features actually occur across the writing population. Two examples, both real measurements from that study. First, an example of a common feature. The cursive lowercase letter e, formed as an enclosed loop. That form was observed in roughly 99% of writers in the sample. 99%. If a question document and a known writer both form their E as an enclosed loop, that is a genuine similarity, and it is worth almost nothing because nearly everybody in the country shares that same form. On the contrary, a less common feature, and this one I suspect you'll recognize from daily life, the dot over the letter I, formed as a circle. You know someone who does this. In this study, that form appeared in roughly about 4% of writers. Same kind of observation, similarity in how a form is made, but this one carries far more weight because it sorts the writing problem instead of describing it. Everyone in this audience already had that intuition. What the research does is convert that intuition into a measurement. Feature frequency is not guesswork. It has in some ways been quantified across a representative population. Now let me draw out the two consequences because they define how a competent examination actually proceeds. First, the examiner looks at the less common features. Similarities in features that most of the population shares can pile up all day without meaning much. Discriminating power, however, lives in the features that few writers share. Second, and this is the sentence I would like the attorneys in the audience to remember, a handwriting conclusion properly rests not on the presence of similarities, but on the absence of differences, provided the writing is sufficiently complex. Similarities are cheap. The study just showed you how cheap a similarity can actually be. What identification or any kind of a common authorship conclusion requires is that a sufficiently complex body of writing, examined thoroughly, has no significant differences remaining. And in elimination, the other direction rests on significant differences that do remain, differences that fall outside of the range of variation of that writer. Which means that everything depends on one thing, establishing the range of variation properly. And that's going to bring us to part 3. Everything so far has argued that the range is where the answer ultimately lives. This part is about actually establishing what it is, what the concept formally is, where it sits within the examination method, and because the school case gave us hours rather than weeks, how it actually gets established at scale. Now, let me give you a formal definition, and I will read it because the words are carefully chosen. The range of variation is ultimately the accumulation of deviations among repetitions of respective handwriting characteristics that are typically demonstrated in the writing habits of an individual. Now, I want you to unpack that. Repetitions. You need the same character or combination occurring again and again. Deviations among those repetitions. The ways that those occur differ from one to another. And accumulation. The range is not any single instance. It is a collected picture of all of them. The range is a property of the whole body of a person's writing, and it can only be seen by looking at the whole body of it. 3 operational requirements somewhat follow, and they're on the slide. First, the range is established from every instance. You determine it by examining each occurrence of character or combination, not just a selected subset. The moment an examiner starts choosing instances to look at, the range stops being the writer's and starts being a sampling created by the examiner. Second, the range is what defines significance. A question form that falls within the known range is exactly that, part of the writer's range of variation. It tells you the observation is consistent with this writer. The form that falls outside that range variation is a difference, and a difference requires explanation. Without the range, the words similar and different really have no measurable meaning. Third, the range requires sufficient comparable writing, an adequate quantity and comparability, writing of the same type, produced under reasonably comparable conditions. A range established from 3 signatures, for example, is not a range. It's 3 data points that help, but they do not establish every variation in alternate style that may exist. Now, if those 3 requirements sound demanding, they are. And that demandingness is exactly where the practical problem of this case lives, because meeting them takes time. And in the instance of a school threat, there isn't much. So hold that tension, and we will resolve it in a few slides. But first, let me place the range inside of the common method that most people will be familiar with, and that is ACE. Now, forensic handwriting examination follows a defined methodology, commonly abbreviated as ACE, analysis, comparison, and evaluation, with a verification as an independent check. And I want to walk you through it briefly, not as a methodology lecture, but to show you where the range actually does its work within the process. Analysis is where the range is actually established. The examiner characterizes the question writing on its own terms, and then characterizes the known writing, again, on its own terms, which means working through known material and determining character by character, feature by feature, combination by combination, and habit by habit, what this writer's natural variation actually looks like. Everything downstream depends on the quality of this step. Comparison is where the framing we built in part 1 starts to matter. Comparison is not image against image. It's not the questioned K held up against one known example of K, which falls precisely into the one known trap that we mentioned earlier, briefly and forgivably. Each question feature, on the contrary, is compared against the range established amongst and between all of the known writing. Evaluation is where the significance is actually assessed. Do the observations fall within the range or beyond it? How much weight does each similarity carry? And which is the rarity question from part 2? Do the differences, if any, exceed the established range can accommodate? The conclusion emerges from that weighing, expressed on a standardized conclusion scale that the discipline produces. Now, notice something about this method. The range appears at every stage. It is built-in analysis, it is the reference and comparison, and is the yardstick in the evaluation phase. Which is why the question of our case, thoroughness on a deadline, is really a question about one specific bottleneck. And let me show you. What you're looking at is a screenshot from a piece of software available to forensic handwriting examiners. On the left is the question writing. This is one of the walls that we saw earlier. On the right is one page of the known writing, of which there were many more. Now, the colored boxes are the software's decisions. It has located the writing on each document down to individual characters. Now, not every character is highlighted. There is the need for user input to make sure it is complete and accurate, but you get the gist. It is here, ultimately, to help find every instance of every character. Now, I want to be candid about what this is solving, because it is narrower and more important problem than most people assume. The bottleneck in a high-volume handwriting examination has never been about the examiner's judgment. Judgment can be fast. The bottleneck, though, is coverage, physically locating every occurrence of every character of interest across a stack of documents. Now, remember the requirement from a few slides ago, establishing from every single instance. When the known writing is extensive amount of homework, for example, or classroom notes, every instance of a single letter can mean finding hundreds of occurrences. Finding them by eye, page by page, is days of clerical work, and the case may really not afford us that. So the workflow on this slide has 3 verbs, and it's worth noticing which of them belong to the software and ultimately which belong to the examiner. Locate every occurrence of the target letter or combination across the entire body of writing. Assemble, put those occurrences together side by side so the complete set for each character can be actually seen in one place. Those are 2 that are both a clerical burden, and that's something that software like this can assist with. Review, however, is the 3rd verb, and it belongs entirely to the examiner. The examiner studies and the complete assembled set instead of hunting for it. Nothing about the examination's logic has changed. What has changed is that the requirement we set, every instance, not a convenient handful, becomes actually physically achievable on a pretty short deadline. So let me show you what that looks like for a single character, because the next screen in my eye is perhaps the most important one of the actual workflow. In this case, we're showing a single query, the letter I. That's all the screen is. And look at what it produces. On the question side, every instance of the lowercase letter I on the wall writing is shown. On the known side, every instance across the known writing on this specific page. And notice, each one is presented not only with the letter, but with the word context from where it actually came. And that's because context matters. A letter at the start of a word, in the middle of a word, or at the end, connected or standing alone, these are all things that may change how a writer's habits will actually express themselves. This is range of variation made visible. It's not a description of it. It's not a sample of it. It is the accumulated set itself. Every occurrence scrollable in one view. When I said earlier that the range is a property of the whole body of writing and can only be seen by looking at the whole body of it, this is exactly what looking at the whole body of it looks like in practice. To be able to say that you have actually looked at every single instance of a given character or character set. Now, I chose the letter I for this demonstration deliberately. 10 minutes ago, I told you that the I dot construction can potentially carry measurable discriminating weight. Now, the 4% figure I gave you was for cursive writing, and what you're looking at here is handprinting, so I won't borrow that number, but the principle does carry somewhat directly. How a writer forms something like a diacritic or an I dot is a habit, and habits distribute unevenly across the writing population. So look at the screen. In the known writing, instance after instance, we can see that this writer's I dots tend toward small circles. And in the question writing, the I diacritic is instead a vertical dash. I'll say no more about that here. We will actually come back to it. But notice what just happened. An observation like that, with every known instance assembled behind it, is simply there to be seen. That is what this view exists to produce. The examiner then does that review of every occurrence, not just a sample, and then repeats that search for every character of interest within the question writing. That is what comprehensive means in this context. It's not a virtue word, it is actually the work product itself. Now, a necessary caution, and I want to state it carefully because this is absolutely about science and not a sales presentation. What software assistance changes is on the left. Software like this can assist you in finding every instance of a character across a large volume of writing. It means that high volume and short timelines don't necessarily have to force sampling. It means that examinations can stay thorough under real-world constraints. That's the claim, that's the whole claim, and it's a claim about coverage, not about judgment. What stays with the examiner, though, is on the right, and it's everything that makes the examination an examination. Assessing the significance of each feature, weighing similarities and differences against the established range of variation, the conclusion itself, and importantly, verification of the software's own output, because detection software, like anything else, can have errors. The examiner confirms what was located is complete and correct, rather than simply taking it on faith. The principle underneath both columns, something that I have removed off the slide, but it's something that I would offer to anybody who evaluates this kind of work. Constraints should not mean less thorough work. Time pressure, volume are facts of casework. They're not licenses to take shortcuts. When we get into those clerical excuses, that's where examinations start to fall apart. And that's what leads me to part 3, what leads me to part 4. You now have the concept, the method, the means. Part 4 is going to talk about what happens when this is not done, and then, as promised, what happened in the case that I referenced earlier. So with part 4, we're going to look at how examinations fail when the range of variation is not fully established, with 4 recurring sources of error. And then we'll go back to 2 notes on the wall and see what happened. Now, here's what makes an incomplete determination of the range of variation genuinely dangerous. It fails silently. An incomplete examination doesn't look incomplete. The work product looks the same. The confidence feels the same. The failure only exists in what is never actually seen, and it produces the exact 2 errors we defined at the start by 2 different mechanisms. Mechanism 1, a false difference. A writer has a variant form, but the examination never sampled it. So when the variant shows up in the question writing, it reads as if it is a difference, something indicative of another writer. The true writer may be excluded. In our case's terms, that means the threat writer walks away and the school stands down on a false all clear. Mechanism 2 is the match on common features. Genuine similarities may be found, and they are real, but they live in features that are common to or shared by many writers. That's our 99% loop D, for instance. Give that similarity more weight than the population data says it can carry, and it becomes misleading. Follow enough of them, and it can lead to the wrong student being accused. Now, notice these are somewhat mirror images. The false difference comes from undersampling the writer. The true writer's own range of variation never is fully established. Common feature match comes in effect from undersampling the population, forgetting how many other hands share the feature. One error clears the guilty, the other accuses the innocent. And both are invisible from inside the examination that commits them, which is precisely why the discipline builds its safeguards, ensuring that people get a complete range of variation for conducting an examination, weigh the rarity of any given feature, conduct verifications where appropriate, and utilize methods rather than trusting just the sense of having done enough. Now, let me make the failure modes a little bit more concrete for you. 4 recurring sources of error, and I like to note that each one violates something that you've already been given in this talk, which is a way of saying the talk's concepts are not merely academic. First, insufficient known samples. Too little known writing or writing not comparable in style or conditions to establish the range of variation at all for the writer. This violates that sufficiency requirement I mentioned earlier. A conclusion built on it isn't wrong exactly, but it is unsupported, which in forensic work more or less amounts to the same thing. Second, we have the possibility of cherry-pick samples, considering only the instances that support an emerging conclusion rather than including every instance. If a feature is found even once within a writer's range of variation, then fundamentally, it cannot be assessed as a difference. You can't cherry pick that and remove that sample as not being common to the writer. It is part of their range of variation. And I like to emphasize that that failure rarely feels like misconduct from the inside. It feels like efficiency. Feels like I am examining as much as I can in the time frame that I have. That is exactly what makes it dangerous. And it's exactly why the standard is to look at every single occurrence, not just representative occurrences. Third, commonality of features in question. Resting a conclusion on similarities in features shared by a substantial portion of writers, this is a rarity lesson that is often ignored. A stack of 99% features is a stack of almost nothing of value. Fourth, confirmation bias. And of course, this one does deserve the most care, because the exposure is fundamentally structural, not personal. Question writing never arrives at an examination alone. It always arrives with a writer attached. And sometimes that suspect, they've selected them for reasons that have nothing to do with the handwriting. Surveillance footage, tip, proximity, opportunity. which means the submission itself carries an implicit message. We think it's this person. Cognitive bias that can be introduced by this kind of information is very real. It's a well-documented phenomenon, and it bears particularly on examiners working within law enforcement laboratories. Not because those examiners are less careful, but because they sit closest to the investigation and its context. And often, they cannot avoid learning things that the examination doesn't actually need. Now, I will say, I spent years in that environment. This is not an observation, or this is an observation from the inside it, not a criticism from the outside. Bias is something that has managed by process, not by willpower, and quite frankly, is the topic of a whole series of other lectures. But I want you to keep those 4 things in mind, because the case we opened with contains them, and in its first act, more than one of them. So going back to our 2 notes on the wall at the school, and here's what happened in order, and I'm going to give it to you about as factually as possible. First, there was an initial review. The writing was assessed by somebody who was not a trained forensic handwriting examiner. The review noticed that there were similarities between the wall writing and a couple of the students' handwriting assignments. Now, I'll let you apply the last 2 slides for yourself. Similarities, we now know, are the cheap half of the evidence. Their value depends entirely on rarity and on whether the differences were sought with equal energy against a properly established range of variation. An untrained review is not positioned to do any of that. Through no fault of intent, it is simply what similarity looks like. It does not see what similarity is worth. Second, based on that initial review, the student was arrested and ultimately charged. And I say that without adornment. On the strength of noted similarities by a layperson, assessed without the discipline we've been spending this about 45 minutes building, a student was arrested for threatening their own school. Third, the comprehensive examination. And here I should tell you about how it came about, because that does matter. This case was never actually submitted to a handwriting expert by law enforcement. Not before the arrest, not after it. I was actually brought into this case by the student's family, and I was asked to be precise about what the family actually asked for, because it was not that they were looking for an advocate. Rather, they wanted to know whether it was their child who did it. That was the assignment. Examine the writing and tell us the answer, whatever it is. So in this examination, an extensive amount of writing was ultimately submitted, far more than just the few homework assignments that were reviewed by the initial person. In addition to images of the question wall writing, there was extensive known writing, including many notebooks worth of the student's writing over an extended period of time. And based on that, every located instance of the characters of interest was done, the range of variation was properly established, similarities weighed against population frequency, and differences assessed against that range. And fourth, the conclusion of the examination. Ultimately, it was probable that the student did not actually write the notes. Now, based on this finding, the student was actually allowed back to school. That said, the criminal case nevertheless proceeded all the way to trial, and at trial, a directed verdict was actually entered in the student's favor. Now, for all the non-lawyers in the audience, what that essentially means is that the court determined that the evidence presented by the prosecution could not support a conviction even before the defense needed to answer it. Now, that is the arc of the case. And the reason I bring this up is because there are real consequences here. By not fully mapping out the range of variation, the wrong student was brought forward, the wrong student suffered the consequences, and ultimately, the person who actually would have been responsible for the writing was always out there, and it was never investigated further. Now, I want to show you in one slide what the comprehensive examination actually found, because the finding is a working demonstration of essentially every concept in this talk. 3 things carry the conclusion at the end of the day, and they're on the slide in the order that they mattered. First, a range of variation was established from extensive known writing. The student's range was established again from homework, classroom notes, and other known writing produced in the normal course of business. And I want to dwell on that phrase for a moment. Normal course of business writing is natural writing produced with no audience in mind and for no reason other than to do whatever that person is trying to do, before there was any investigation or any attempt to potentially influence the writing. As a foundation for establishing a writer's genuine habits, that's about as good as no material gets. Now, ideally, in a case like this, we would want to have comparable known writing in comparable situations as well. However, the chances are that we're going to find a known writing on a wall for any writer in most contexts is going to be pretty limited. So we do the best that we can with what is available. Second, the finding. There were numerous repeated significant differences. Question forms, including the I diacritic written above as a vertical dash, that fell outside the student's established range of variation. And for example, not once and not in any of these features. They were repeatedly across multiple characteristics. For example, that I diacritic was compared to over 760 examples of that student writing that letter, and it did not ever occur. Now, I want you to recall the principle from part 2. Conclusions rest on the absence of differences, and eliminations or conclusions of non-common authorship rest on their presence. Here, we had significant differences that were present, and they kept being present and were repeated throughout the question writing. Third, the depth behind that finding. Again, for some characteristics, the question form was compared against literally hundreds of located known examples and still fell outside the range of variation they established. And I want you to feel the evidentiary weight of that sentence. A form absent from a handful of exemplars invites an objection that you simply didn't see enough of the writer. A form absent across hundreds of located instances of natural, undisguised writing does not. At that depth, the range is about as thoroughly established as a range can be, and a form outside of it is simply outside of it. And the line at the bottom of this slide is a summary of the discipline's logic applied. No single difference had to carry the conclusion. The pattern of repeated significant differences against a thoroughly established range of variation is what ultimately did. And so let me leave you with that in one breath. Handwriting is a dynamic pattern. So it varies across every time it is produced. That variation runs in two directions, between writers and within them, and not every feature is ultimately worth the same. The examiner's task is to establish each writer's range of variation, complexity, and do so from every instance. And modern tools mean that time pressure no longer is a reason that that can't be done. Because when it isn't done, examinations fail silently in both directions, and real people ultimately will carry the cost. Now, in this case, a comprehensive examination did not find the writer of the two notes. What it did was keep the wrong student from answering for them. In my judgment, that is not necessarily a lesser outcome. That is the discipline doing exactly what it is designed to do. In high-stakes casework, ultimately, every letter does count. And with that, I would like to thank again Panacea Cooperative Research and Zibian Labs for hosting this, and thank you all for your attention.